Good afternoon, and welcome to everyone who's here with us for Lunch and Learn today. We are here on the United Synagogues channel doing our regular Lunch and Learn slot, and it is a real pleasure and a privilege to be taking this week's slot. My name is Rabbi Daniel Epstein of Fosters and then Southgate Synagogue, and I'll be guiding us today through some ideas and thoughts in the Parasha of Toledot, which is the Sedra we are up to. Had we been in Shul, that's what we'll be reading in Shul, but as we're not, we're going to take some ideas with us into Shabbat. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen, and in that way we'll get a chance to see some thoughts and ideas that we have. We're basing our ideas on the wonderful teachings of Nechama Leibovitz, her book Here Always, in the entire Sedra we are going through in our community, through every single parasha of the Torah. We started 3 years ago, and we are doing that every Wednesday evening. We are now up to Bar Midbar, but it's nice to get back into the Parasha of the week. So, as I said, this week's Parasha of Toledot continues the extraordinary, epic journey of our forefathers, trying to figure out their relationship with God. The whole book of Genesis, the whole book of Parasha is all about relationships. And the important part to understand is that their relationships with all of their challenges, all of their difficulties, and sometimes with some tremendous failures along the way. And that's really quite surprising and quite enlightening for a Torah. The Torah is very honest as a book. It's very open in that way. And in that sense, the Torah wants us to learn about family. The best way to learn about family or anything is through stories. Before I go on, just to say that this week's Parasha is we are dedicating this to two members of our community who sadly passed away within a few days of each other. The Levaya for Martin Cole was yesterday afternoon at Bushy New Cemetery, and the Levaya for Sharon Cole, Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's divine guidance and help, will be this afternoon at Bushy Cemetery again. A husband and wife who were inseparable from the ages of 15 and 18. She was 15, he was 18, and they celebrated many years of marriage together. And with that, they've known each other for almost 70 years, which is an extraordinary way to live. So what we are looking at today is the shiur, which is dedicated to them, Mordechai ben Binyamin and Sarah bat Yaakov, and wishing the family, Michelle Ambalo and the whole family, grandchildren, Talia and Zach, Chaim Arukim, long life, and also to Jeremy Cole, their son. So let's get straight into our idea and see where we're up to. We're going to scroll up a little bit on our sheet, and we're going to start to look at the first two sources together. So the first one you can see at the top of the page is from Genesis 27:34. We are in the middle of the story. We're going to go down ever so slightly so we can see the first word of the thing. Thank you very much to my fabulous technology assistant. Kishma Esav et divrei aviv vayitzak tza'aka gdola umara ad me'od. What happens is that Esav, who is getting the bracha, if you remember the story, Yitzchak is blessing his two sons, Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov has, through his mother's, some would say ingenuity, some would say deception, a fascinating idea early in our Sedra. She has convinced her younger son, Yaakov, to put on skins that make him look and feel and smell like his brother, who is a hunter and always outdoors. And she's asked him to go and tell their father that he's actually Esau. And we have the very famous line, Hakol kol Yaakov v'hayadayim yedei Esav, that your voice sounds like Jacob, but your hands feel like Esau, says Isaac, whose eyesight is failing, we are told in the Torah. And nevertheless, Jacob goes forward and he convinces his father through his smell, through the touch, that he is in fact Esau. And Isaac is not quite sure, but nevertheless, he gives him the bracha that was intended for the firstborn. And he gives him the bracha, he should be strong, and he should have a strong strength in the land, and he should have everything that he needs. If we're just looking at the parasha, it says, just very quickly, and he says, you've brought me these things, and he said, I'm going to give you this wonderful bracha. And he says, I'll give you from the best of the heavens, mishmanei haaretz, and from the fat of the land, rov dagan v'tirosh, these wonderful types of crops. You're going to be blessed with material wealth and material strength, and those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. It has these motifs of Abraham, and he's told that, remember, when he leaves Haran, and he's told by God to go on his journey. So Esau has not come into the picture yet, and Jacob has taken the firstborn blessing. And as he walks away, Esau comes in later, serves his father the same type of food that Jacob had served him earlier. And he goes up to his father and he says to him, I'm here for my blessing. He goes, who are you? He goes, I'm Esau. He goes, that can't be. He says, because I just gave you a blessing. And Esau realizes that he has been hoodwinked by his brother. And this is not the first time, says the Torah. Not the first time, as he says, says Esau about his brother, you've hoodwinked me twice, and I'm still going through with this. So there's a challenging moment there. And when he realizes what's happened, and that he's been gypped literally out of his firstborn blessing, he says this. We're reading from source 1. When Esau hears his father's words, and I've highlighted these words in a dark red, Vayitzak tza'aka gdola umara ad me'od. And it says here colloquially, he bursts into a wild and bitter sobbing. If we were to translate each word individually, Vayitzak means he shouted, tza'aka, a shout, a cry, gdola, very good, very large, umara, and bitter, ad me'od, until extremes. In other words, exceedingly. So he cries an exceedingly bitter cry. Please bless me too, Father. In other words, he says, you can't not let me have my blessing. What's interesting, in fact, is that, Esau receives pretty much the same blessing as his brother. If you look in the Torah, and I invite you to do that over Shabbat when you're home and you're looking through the Parasha. It's been fascinating to be home. It's difficult not to daven with a minyan. It's difficult not to daven in shul, but the time you get to go through the Parasha is just wonderful. Read it in Hebrew, read it in English. Notice the motifs and the ideas, the things you would normally miss. You get a chance to do that when you're at home. So those, for me, are some of the small benefits of being able to have time to look through the Sedra. Of course, outweighed by the tremendous sadness of not seeing people in shul. But we do what we can in these difficult times. So what he says is, please bless me, my father. Please, I lost out on this major blessing, and his cry, you can hear it. It's deep and it's heart-wrenching and it's desperate. And he's upset, but in the moment after this verse, he's going to get angry. He's going to threaten to kill his brother. And Rivka realizes that Jacob is in serious danger, and she tells him, you need to go north to Haran, go to my brother, and he will take care of you. And the story continues. But at this point, Asa has let go this cry that you see in the film, this sort of no. You can imagine it echoing across mountains, horrendous, heart-wrenching cry that he has been taken away from what it was rightfully he felt was his birthright, not obviously realizing or not wanting to realize that he had sold it fairly and squarely to his brother in a previous episode. So that's what we have. Genesis tells us about this terrible cry, and it seems to be quite out of place almost. He's upset that he gets a bracha afterwards, but this cry seems to not have enough of a realization or enough of a validation, as it were, that he's supposed to be crying that hard. So let's go into it. The Chama Leibovitz always loves to compare words where they appear in the Torah. Like Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, who always loved to look for the etymological nuance, the words which were dancing off the page, giving you a sense of exactly what the Torah was trying to say behind the words. He always quotes this beautiful idea from Emil Fackenheim. He said the Torah, specifically Genesis, is fraught with background. There's so much going on that we don't have the text for. And you can imagine that if somebody were to write the screenplay, it would have a lot of the text that we have in the Torah, but so much more would need to be painted for us. And that's what the Midrash often does. So let's compare this fascinating moment in Genesis with another similar cry in the Book of Esther. So we know the idea of the Book of Esther, and we realize what's happening in the Torah, in the book, and we know because it's Purim, and we're reading the Megillah, and please God we'll have a chance to hear the Megillah in Shul, although, again, we have no idea where things are going. We hope and pray we'll be back in our shuls very soon. But we're looking at now source 2, and Mordechai Yada, so Mordechai knows everything that has happened, and what has happened specifically. He's heard that Haman is going to destroy all the Jews. Remember this very famous phrase he gives? He says, "V'shloshasar liyom lechodesh adar u'shlalam navos," as we say in the Al HaNisim prayer. That is the day when they're going to eradicate all of the Jewish people across 127 provinces in the whole of what we would call the Persian Empire. right across the whole area. It says Mihodu vad Kush, which if we're looking to modern words, Hodu is India, Kush is Ethiopia. So you can imagine this huge crescent going right through Asia, right across and down into Africa, the whole, as it were, known world. That was how large the Persian Empire was. And Mordechai hears that Haman's plan is to destroy the entire Jewish people, a genocidal edict that goes out. And when he hears about it, let's look at this phrase carefully. Mordechai yada, we're at the top of source 2. Et kol asher na'asa vayikra Mordechai et begadav. So Mordechai yada, he knew or he heard about all that was going to happen, or kol asher na'asa, all that was done. Vayikra Mordechai et begadav. And Mordechai tears his clothes in anguish. And that is related to a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. When we go to funerals, we tear our clothes. This idea of tearing a garment shows outwardly what we're feeling inwardly. And so the idea of tearing clothes signifies a tremendous sense of loss. By Yubash sak va'efe, and he wears sackcloth and ashes, literally. This phrase that we use even in modern terminology. To be wearing sackcloth is a terrible expression of mourning and of grief and of absolute abject sadness. And he goes out into the middle of the town. He doesn't do this on his own. He goes into the middle of the town square. And he cries out, za'aka, which is a cry, bidola, which is very large, umara, and bitter. So you can see, if we just scroll back a little bit to the previous source, source 1, what we're looking at, in fact, is a combination of the words which seem to be very close. Za'aka with a tzadi in source 1, za'aka with a zayin in source 2. We could say that these letters are interchangeable, much as in Aramaic, the letters of the shin and taf are interchangeable, such that you get the word tlat, even in Arabic, which means shalosh, 3, because the taf and the shin are interchangeable. We have these words that are, as it were, mirroring themselves. There is a sense that the writers of the Book of Esther wanted to give us an understanding of what it meant to have such a great cry. And what they've done is they've borrowed literally a motif from Genesis, and they have come and written it in such a way that you are instantly transported back through your sense of reference into another story completely. And that idea is very important when trying to compare things in the Torah. We often look for similar words in different contexts, and that helps us to understand exactly what we're supposed to be appreciating from these words. So here we have 2 verses, one in Genesis and one in the Book of Esther, and they're very much connected. And Mordechai, of course, for me, is very much today about Martin, Cole, who passed away, and his wife, whose Hebrew name was Sarah. Again, this idea that he looked after her, not quite Esther, but there was a sense of looking after people. We were intimately connected. And when Mordechai, who is the head of the Sanhedrin, who is the equivalent of the head of the Beth Din, the head of the Jewish community, as it were, at the time, when he cries out a great cry, you know that behind that cry there's real depth, there's real anguish, and there's real concern, not for himself, but for a much broader public. He's worried about the entire Jewish nation, and his cry is one on behalf of others. We could almost say that in source 1, the cry of Asa is very much self-centered. It's about him, and that was him in a nutshell, very much self-centered in that sense, and that's what we get. So let's try and get an understanding as to whether there's a connection between these two. So we can see that the words are connected etymologically. They have the same phraseology. And now we're going to move into source 3, which is a midrash. As I said, the midrash is a fascinating collection of stories and descriptions and ideas. If you can imagine, somebody gives you a very, very short letter. It says, dear friend, please help. Regards, Daniel. And if that was the case, it's a generic letter. It has no context. You don't know who it is. You don't know who Daniel is. You don't know what the help is required. And you have no idea as to how serious this letter is. Maybe somebody was practicing translation from another language. No one knows what that word means. If you get a card like that, and you know this Daniel, for example, and you know that it's someone you've been in touch with, and they are struggling with things in life, and when they write to you, dear whoever it is, please help. Regards, Daniel, you know that please help from this particular person has much more urgency, has much more of a sense of concern and a sense of immediacy that you need to take care of, as opposed to please help. I'm looking for something interesting for my project I'm doing next year, and I'd love to get some more information. Please help. It's a very different type of please help. And what the Midrash does, in a nutshell, is it provides context to all of the Torah that we learn. We have words which are on the page, we have stories which are developed, but the Midrash is trying to come at it and help us to find the frames of reference to help us understand the story in a better sense. So the Midrash is not halakha. It's not trying to teach you what to do or how to behave. It's trying to give you a sense of how you're supposed to be viewing what it's trying to describe. And the Midrash Rabbah is on Bereshit Rabbah, which means it is the Midrash on the book of Bereshit, on the book of Genesis. It's in chapter 67, because it goes through in different sections, and we've just taken a small part out. I'm not going to read the Hebrew because it's mostly in Aramaic, but we are going to look at the English. So the English says as follows: whoever maintains that the Holy One, blessed be He, is a foregoer of His just claims, may he forego his life. Let's try and understand what this means. Anybody who understands God and understands He is a vatran. Vatran means somebody who's willing to set aside their own personal, as it were, aggrandizement, their own personal honor. And they realize that in certain cases, you can't, as it were, think about you as being the most important person in the room. Sometimes you have to forego your own personal space in order to allow other people either to shine or to be able to say what they need to. And sometimes you need to, as it were, retreat somewhat into the background and allow other people to be there. So anybody who says that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is a vatran, hu yitvatuhun b'nei mo'ohi, right? In other words, he is not someone who gives up completely, but rather he basically is long-suffering, but ultimately he will collect his due. So in here, there's two different phrases. Vatran can mean somebody who gives up or who pushes his honor away because it's not something he requires. Vatran can also mean somebody who compromises to such an extent that they lose sight of what's important. So vitur is some form of a compromise, or you give ground in a negotiation. So levater is to actually, as I said, to retreat somewhat to allow other people to be there. But to be a vatran sometimes can mean to completely disengage with what you said was important. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he says, is not like that. He won't take immediate action. He will hold back, in a sense, and he will wait for an opportune time later in history in order to exact the punishment which was needed. Many times we hear that somebody has done something wrong and something terrible happens to them, God forbid, in very close proximity. And we, in our simple-mindedness, assume that what they did wrong has an immediate effect, right? Had you done this, this wouldn't have happened. In some nefarious cases and circumstances, people can say the most horrendous things, trying to connect somebody's, what they perceive as ill actions, with what they see as a just reward or just punishment. I think the word karma would be used if it wasn't a Torah at lunch and learn, we might use it a little more. But the notion of karma is that idea that somehow there's a connection between what you've done and the reward you'll get. It's a very, very broad philosophical idea, because we always like to think that our mitzvot, the good deeds that we do, will result in good things for us. And the broad understanding is that that is true. In other words, if you behave in a certain way, if you're correct, if you are careful and considerate and compassionate and kind, then the laws of the universe and the laws of our existence tell us that we would hope to expect that people will behave the same way to us. What you give out, you receive back. And so we're always encouraged to behave appropriately and to do well. But when we do something bad or something wrong, there is a chance that we don't get punished immediately from God's perspective. God will not punish from our understanding immediately. He holds on to these punishments. There's this beautiful idea which we say around Rosh Hashanah time. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have this beautiful song that has come into our liturgy beautifully, as we said, by the Shabbat on Choir by Stephen Glass, of Mochel Avonot. We have this song we sing near Rosh Hashanah. Mochel Avonot, Mochel Avonot Amor. This lovely tune takes us back into that slichot mode. And the next words are Ma'avir Rishon Rishon. God takes our sins, as it were, and he passes them one at a time across, as it were, his barcode scanner. If you can imagine, God is at the checkout. And all of our sins and all of our good deeds are at the checkout. And sometimes he'll pass all of our good deeds through first, and then we've got to try and weigh them up against the things we may not have done so well during the year. And so God, in a metaphorical sense, starts passing them through one at a time. I wasn't nice to my friends. I wasn't respectful to my parents. I didn't tell somebody I was not giving them enough change when I should have done. All these sorts of little things, and we pass them through, and slowly we see our credit balance start to reduce. There's a point at which there's going to be a credit balance that reduces and a debit balance that starts to increase. And at the point where they get very, very close, God says, I'm going to hold on to these ones. I'm not going to give them back to you yet, because I want you to do more good deeds. And then when you have more, as it were, good deeds in the bank, I'll be able to pass through some of the things you need to, as it were, pay your dues for, literally. And I'll pass them through in such a way that you'll stay in a net credit. As a bank manager, God will look after us. And so that's what he's saying now, that God will collect the dues that are appropriate for actions some point in the future. And so our job is to trust that God will know exactly how to do that. And so this quote says, ultimately, God will collect his due at the right time. As it says, Jacob made Esau break out in a cry but once. But where was he punished for it? So where is Jacob here being punished for making Esau cry out this way? A fascinating idea. It's not Esau that was wrong. It's Jacob that is seen here as acting inappropriately. And even though the bracha did go to him, even though we know that the succession of the Jewish people comes down through a line of transmission from Abraham through Isaac and through Jacob, it doesn't pass through Ishmael or Esau in our tradition. And so, but nevertheless, Jacob acted, in this case, it would seem, according to the Midrash, inappropriately. And he made Esau cry out in a way that was really, really shouldn't have been, inappropriate. And Esau's cry was held onto by God. And God holds onto it until he feels that a time that the cry is required in return. And that cry comes from Shushan, the capital of Shushan, in the story of Esther. So you can imagine God, as it were, holding on to this particular cry. He puts it in a jar, he puts it on a shelf and says, this one is for later. I can't find time now or the appropriate situation now where this cry is going to need its mirror, but somewhere in history there will be a cry that will be let out, and that will be the offset and mirror for Jacob acting inappropriately at the time for his brother Esau. Amazing. And so what happens is, it says, Vahecha nifra lo, and where was this? Nifra is a word that we use in Hebrew. It's the third line of source 3, the second word. The word nifra means to redeem or reclaim a debt. So when you finish paying off a loan, it's nifra. The loan is actually paid off in full. In other words, it has now been expunged and exonerated. And where does this expunging of the original cry from Esau come? It comes in the story of Esther. The Shushan Habirah, it says in Shushan, the capital, as it says in the Megillah, as we said, Vayizak Zaka Gedolah Umara Ad Me'od. And so God has taken, as it were, all that time to get from one point to the other. The cry happens in Genesis, and the response in historical and in emotional terms is held back by God until Mordechai cries out, and he, as it were, gives voice to what Jacob has caused to his brother Esau. This idea that we are responsible for what our parents have done is a very, very, again, difficult psychological and philosophical concept to get into. We only have 30 minutes and just 5 more minutes left, so we can't get into it. But the idea is that it's not that we are held responsible for what our parents have done, but we should feel responsible for how they have acted. If they have acted well, we can benefit from that and we can take that forward. If they have acted inappropriately, then we have to take that forward and make sure that we have done the work that would be required to move ourselves out of that negative situation. As we say on Yom Kippur, Anachnu ve'avotenu chatanu. Both us and our forefathers have sinned. The idea is that we are part of a collective that goes all the way back through history. And that way we understand that we have our own personal changes to make, but we also are responsible for what came before us. And by extension, the way we behave in this life will set people on the path of correctness for the generations to come. We finally will go to the small part, which is source 4. Rashi now comments on a pasuk. Thank you very much for scrolling. A pasuk on in Psalms chapter 80, verse 6. And the verse in Tehillim says this. And it's a very interesting verse, especially the way it is translated. And we'll see another beautiful access to the etymology, to the words and the nuance that comes through from the words themselves. He'echaltem lechem dim'ah. You fed them tears as their daily bread. He'echaltem, from the word ochel, meaning food. Ha'achil or he'echal means to cause somebody to food. In other words, to cause them to eat. In other words, to feed. Lechem, which is bread. Dim'ah, which are tears. We say hazorim b'dimah barina yuktoru. We say that all the time in benching. It's words that say if we sow with tears, we will reap with joy. So he'echaltem lechem dim'ah. You have fed them, people, Jewish people, the bread of tears, literally. Bread that is soaked in tears, it is challenging, we've had difficult times. The tashkemo b'dmaot shalish. And you have tashkemo, to make them drink, from the word lahashkim, which is very interesting to get to Shechem, which is in fact a sycamore tree. But tashkemo is from the word from tishteh, also from to drink. So we have all sorts of ideas here of things that hold water, right? So you've given them bread which is soaked in tears to eat, and you have given them tears to drink. But it says shalish, which means great measures. But you and I know that the word shalish doesn't just mean great. Miracle idea, right? Shalish comes from the word shalosh or shlosha, meaning three. Achat is one, shtaim is two, shalosh is three. And so what Rashi says on this particular verse, Rashi is our 11th century commentator, he says on this verse that these words actually take us back to another idea of a threefold concept. So shlish means a lot, but it also has a specific connotation of meaning third. And in that way, we're going to see what Rashi does with these words. What does he say? He says, our rabbi has explained that the threefold tears, it says in the words in the middle of the first Hebrew line, V'rabotenu pirshuhu al gimel demaot shehorid Esav. Three different types of tears that Esav cried, as it were. Shneimar, as it says, Vayitzak tzahaka gedola umara. If I just jump between the words in red, you'll see that verse from above has been broken up. And what they say is Vayitzak tzahaka. The first phrase, which is he cried bitter, right? That's one. Gedola is two. That means big. Umara, and very bitter, right, is three. So what Rashi is trying to say here is that people who are us, the Jewish people, who have to put up with so many large measures of tears, Rashi has seen in that word shalish, he's reminded, he is inspired to see a link between the three tears which are referenced in this verse in Psalms. He references again back into the words of Esther, and he references a third time back into the words of Asaph. And he sees all of these as being connected. People who cry need to have something to cry about. And people who need to cry in proportion. It's no point, it's no help, says Rashi in this sense, crying to a point that doesn't make any sense. We know what happened when that happened in our history. The 12 spies come back from spying out the land of Israel. There are 10 spies who give a good report, but 10 spies give a bad report, and 2 spies give a good one. But the 10 who give a bad report are the people who've convinced the entire people of Israel they will not be able to make it into the land of Israel. And they cry all night. Right? They surely cry all night. And God says, in another beautiful midrash, which Rashi quotes at the time of the spies in Shlach Lecha, he says, if you've cried all night for nothing, I will give you something to cry about. And that he references the destruction of the temples. So here we are, the end of our service. We can put our sheet away and we can come back to see you all. And what we're going to say is, in conclusion, this idea that we have tears that we cry, we have expressions that we make and emotions that are let out. And if we don't let our emotions out in the appropriate way, they will come back somewhere else in history and they will come back to haunt us. And that, in a sense, is very much an idea of the mental health that we need to maintain at these difficult times, especially as we have said, having the challenge of trying to get through the sadness of losing such a dear and phenomenal rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, and for the family today who are saying goodbye to 2 parents in 2 days. And that, I think, again, gives a tremendous tza'aka gedola u'mara ad me'od. And it is for us, not just as families, but as people, to look after them, to make sure that our actions reflect all of the teachings and all of the goodness that Rabbi Sachs wanted for us and for the world, and ultimately for the family today, that their cries of sadness should be turned to tears of joy. And those should be, as we say in Psalm 30, it says, turn my sadness into joy, turn my sackcloth into clothes of beauty. And please God, we'll have a chance to enjoy wonderful times, only smachot together. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Wishing everybody a very good day.